Hi, I'm Jackson Browne.
Don't let us get sick. Don't let us get old. Don't let us get...
You think you know Jackson Browne? The thoughtful lyrics, the California vibe, the heartfelt activism. But what if I told you that behind the scenes he was furious at 6 mega-famous bands that he believed destroyed the soul of music? From calling one group emotional fast food to accusing another of the biggest betrayal in music history, this story is about to get explosive. As a music reporter who has followed Jackson Browne's journey since the golden age of Laurel Canyon, it is impossible to ignore the tension that brewed between him and the band Toto, one of the most skilled groups of studio musicians to emerge from Los Angeles in the late 1970s. Browne, widely respected as an introspective songwriter whose lyrics carried both social meaning and emotional weight, suddenly found himself sharing the stage and the charts with a band celebrated for its technical mastery and flawless production. Toto represented the epitome of polish and perfection, every note executed with surgical precision, every arrangement crafted with meticulous detail. Yet it was precisely this technical brilliance that Browne found so troubling. He was reportedly heard telling fellow Asylum Records artists during a Sunset Strip gathering that David Paich and Jeff Porcaro make music like they're working in a laboratory, not in the human heart. According to multiple accounts, Browne even stormed out of a recording session at the record plant when a producer suggested they try to emulate Toto's sound, muttering that he would never participate in what he described as the sterilization of American music. What genuinely infuriated Browne wasn't their musicianship, he respected talent, but their cold, clinical approach to emotional expression, which to him stripped music of its humanity. In his eyes, Toto's success embodied what he bitterly referred to as elevator music for yuppies, pristine but soulless productions that valued sonic perfection over authentic connection. This philosophical clash highlighted the widening gulf within the California music scene at the time. Browne with his acoustic vulnerability and heartfelt lyrics on one side, Toto with their slick radio-ready anthems on the other, two visions of popular music that could never truly reconcile. Covering the rise of arena rock in the early 1980s, I repeatedly encountered REO Speedwagon as both a symbol of overwhelming commercial success and a target for Jackson Browne's harshest criticism. The Illinois band reached stratospheric fame with the 1980 album High Infidelity, topping charts with glossy power ballads like Keep on Loving You and filling stadiums with thousands of fans singing along to every chorus. But where most of America heard anthems, Browne heard formulas. According to several sources, including Billboard correspondent Janet Stevens, Browne vented to fellow activists during a Malibu beach cleanup that Kevin Cronin and Gary Richrath think every song needs a giant chorus that teenagers can scream at concerts, reducing human heartbreak to what he called emotional fast food. In Browne's view, love songs should be written to help people understand themselves more deeply, not simply to give them something to belt out while drunk at parties. That biting assessment spread rapidly through California's socially conscious songwriter circles, sparking heated debates about the meaning of authenticity in pop music. His disdain wasn't just theoretical either. Witnesses claimed that at a Chicago music festival where both acts were billed, Browne flatly refused to be introduced to REO backstage, reportedly telling organizers that he would not meet people who commodify human emotions. For him, REO Speedwagon represented the triumph of market calculation over artistic sincerity, proof that the industry was turning relationships and heartbreak, the very subjects he treated with nuance and care, into mass-produced stadium chants designed to sell tickets and t-shirts. From a reporter's standpoint, the episode underscored just how deep Browne's convictions ran, and how hostile he could become when confronted with music he believed cheapened life's most profound experiences. From the vantage point of a reporter covering the adult contemporary boom of the early 1980s, one of the more fascinating and perhaps most romantically motivated clashes in Jackson Browne's long list of grievances came with the Australian duo Air Supply, whose soft harmonies and sentimental ballads dominated radio at the time. On the surface, their songs like All Out of Love and Every Woman in the World seemed harmless, soothing, and even uplifting for millions of fans across the globe, yet for Browne they represented everything wrong with the commercialization of love and music. He was reportedly overheard in a Santa Monica coffee shop, surrounded by fellow songwriters, scoffing that Russell Hitchcock and Graham Russell think love is some fairy tale fantasy instead of the complex, painful reality most people actually experience. To him, Air Supply wasn't offering guidance or solidarity to listeners grappling with real heartbreak and difficult relationships. Instead, they were selling what he derisively described as greeting card philosophy, simplistic platitudes that avoided the messy truth in favor of dreamlike illusions. What particularly enraged Browne was not just that Air Supply was commercially successful, but that their version of romance became the dominant narrative on radio, overshadowing more nuanced storytelling. He believed songs had the power to teach, to heal, to help people navigate the challenges of commitment, betrayal, and reconciliation. But Air Supply in his eyes was peddling delusions that did none of that. The conflict reportedly reached its breaking point at an Asylum Records showcase where, according to witnesses, Browne actually walked out during their set, muttering to his manager that he refused to watch people peddling romantic mythology to vulnerable audiences. For Browne, the contrast was clear. While he bled honesty into every line of songs like The Pretender or Fountain of Sorrow, Air Supply floated on clouds of sugary fantasy, turning love into a commercialized product rather than an honest exploration of the human heart. From a reporter's perspective, this feud was less about personal animosity and more about a philosophical war over whether music should comfort people with illusions or challenge them with truths, a battle that Browne felt Air Supply had chosen to abandon entirely. As a reporter chronicling the rise of corporate rock in the early 1980s, I witnessed how Jackson Browne's contempt for the supergroup Asia crystallized into one of his most scathing critiques, one that symbolized the clash between humility and artistry and the arrogance of celebrity-driven collaboration. Asia, formed in 1981 with members from Yes, King Crimson, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, was a dream lineup on paper and a marketing juggernaut in reality, conquering both MTV and the album charts with their debut release. But to Browne, this was less about artistic achievement and more about packaging names to sell records. He reportedly sneered during a fundraising dinner for an environmental coalition, telling colleagues that Jeff Downes and John Wetton think throwing famous names together automatically creates meaningful music, dismissing the entire concept as a kind of musical fantasy football league for aging prog rockers. His disdain spread quickly through progressive music circles, with some privately agreeing while others accused him of bitterness. What struck Browne most was that Asia's success represented, in his eyes, creative stagnation. Instead of pushing boundaries, the supergroup leaned heavily on brand recognition and technical bombast, which he contemptuously dubbed committee rock. For Browne, who valued personal evolution through solitary songwriting and social activism, Asia's formula embodied creative bankruptcy, a refusal to risk vulnerability in favor of safe, prepackaged stardom. The animosity peaked at a Los Angeles industry party in 1982, where witnesses claimed Browne declined introductions to Asia members, bluntly telling organizers he would not validate the death of authentic artistic development. From my reporting, what makes this feud particularly telling is that it wasn't only about Asia's music but about the broader cultural shift it symbolized. A move away from the earnest, community-driven ethos of the Laurel Canyon songwriters scene and toward a corporate model where music became another commodity to be assembled, branded, and sold like any other product. Browne's rejection of Asia was less about the individuals involved and more about what they collectively represented, a betrayal of the idea that music, at its best, should be born of honesty, risk, and genuine artistic pursuit. As a reporter who has followed the arc of American rock and its many stylistic transformations, the disappointment Jackson Browne felt toward Chicago stands out as one of his most personal and emotionally charged conflicts, because unlike other bands he criticized, this was a group he once admired deeply for their innovation and musicianship. In the early 1970s, Chicago had been at the forefront of jazz rock fusion, blending complex horn arrangements with socially conscious lyrics and progressive experimentation that excited both critics and fellow musicians, including Browne himself. But by the mid to late 1970s, the band shifted direction toward softer pop ballads and a more commercially friendly sound, a pivot that, according to insiders, Browne experienced not merely as a stylistic change but as a betrayal of shared ideals. At a Laurel Canyon gathering, he was overheard lamenting to close friends that Terry Kath and Robert Lamb once represented everything beautiful about American music evolution. But now, in his view, the band had abandoned that role for easy chart success. His comments were not delivered with casual disdain but with a tone of almost mournful regret, as though watching a comrade give up the cause they once fought for together. Industry sources noted that Browne referred to Chicago's new direction as artistic suicide, charging that their simplified pop arrangements embodied the very problem he saw spreading across the music world: the surrender of creativity for profit. The pain was particularly sharp because Browne had always believed that artists bore a responsibility to elevate listeners, to push boundaries, to mirror both the beauty and the contradictions of American life. When Chicago chose instead to flood radio with syrupy love songs, he felt as though they had abandoned that sacred responsibility, and worse, betrayed the inspiration they once provided to him personally. The sense of personal loss became more pronounced when both Browne and Chicago found themselves on similar touring circuits, playing comparable venues but representing diametrically opposed missions. To Browne, Chicago had not just changed styles. They had switched sides in the battle for the soul of American popular music, and his bitterness toward them reflected less a rivalry than a profound sense of disillusionment with what had once been a beacon of artistic integrity. In all my years reporting on music, few stories encapsulate the raw tension between community ideals and commercial ambition quite like the feud between Jackson Browne and the Eagles, a rupture that turned neighbors into adversaries and split the Laurel Canyon scene into rival camps. In the early 1970s, Browne and the Eagles shared more than just a record label at Asylum Records. They shared a cultural movement rooted in collaboration, authenticity, and a belief that music could serve as a transformative force in society. For a time, they were allies, trading songs, sharing stages, and building the very foundation of what came to be known as the California sound. But as the Eagles began to ascend into stratospheric commercial success with massive albums like Hotel California, Browne's admiration curdled into anger, because he felt they had abandoned the communal ethos that bound the canyon together. According to former Troubadour booking agent Linda Ronstadt, Browne once confided at a neighborhood dinner that Don Henley and Glenn Frey used to believe in what we were all building together here. But in his eyes, their pursuit of fame and fortune had corrupted that vision. The resentment reportedly reached nuclear levels when Henley was said to have dismissed Browne's environmental activism as naive idealism during an Asylum Records meeting, a slight that cut deeply into Browne's identity as an activist musician. From then on, Browne's rhetoric hardened. He allegedly declared that the Eagles were the most successful betrayal of the artistic community in American music history, a damning statement that circulated widely through industry circles. Witnesses at private songwriter gatherings claimed Browne would rail against the band, accusing them of building their empire on community trust and then abandoning those values once they had secured their independence from the scene. The feud was not only personal but symbolic, representing the collapse of the Laurel Canyon dream itself, with Browne holding on to the belief that music should change the world while accusing the Eagles of proving that music could simply fill bank accounts. For those of us covering the story, it was clear this was no ordinary rivalry but a seismic fracture that revealed the deep fault lines in the California music community, a story of shared beginnings that ended in what Browne saw as nothing less than betrayal at the heart of the movement he loved. As a reporter tracing Jackson Browne's long trail of conflicts, it becomes clear that his resentment toward specific bands like Toto, REO Speedwagon, Air Supply, Asia, Chicago, and even the Eagles was not only about stylistic disagreements or personal clashes. It was part of a larger battle over what he believed to be the fundamental purpose of music. Browne often spoke, both publicly and in private conversations, about his conviction that music had a moral obligation to challenge, to question, and to reflect the messy complexities of human life. To him, songwriting was not just entertainment, it was an ethical act, a way to push society toward deeper reflection and even change. The bands he targeted, in his view, represented a betrayal of that duty by reducing art to formulas, illusions, or commercial strategies designed to move units rather than move hearts. What made his criticisms resonate was that they came not from jealousy. Browne had his own considerable success, but from an almost prophetic sense of responsibility. He once told a Berkeley radio host that when you turn heartbreak into stadium chants, you're cheapening the most important experiences people have, a line that encapsulates both his passion and his scorn. From my perspective as a journalist, Browne's anger reveals not only his own perfectionism but also the broader cultural tensions of his era. The clash between authenticity and commodification, art as a tool for transformation versus art as a product on a shelf. The six bands were simply avatars of a deeper struggle that defined the late 1970s and early 1980s music industry, and Browne's outspoken critiques made him a lightning rod in that ongoing debate. Yet covering Browne's career also meant seeing the personal and professional costs of his relentless honesty, because while his critiques earned him admiration among purists and activists, they also left him increasingly isolated within the very industry he hoped to reform. By the mid-1980s, many executives viewed him as difficult, not because of his talent, few doubted that, but because of his unwillingness to compromise. Fellow artists who had once collaborated with him sometimes kept their distance, wary of being the next target of his disdain. Behind the scenes, some insiders whispered that Browne's bitterness was eating away at him, that in fighting so fiercely for principles, he risked losing friends, allies, and opportunities. He was, in a sense, both respected and feared, a man admired for his courage but avoided for his sharp tongue. Fans loved his candor in interviews, but record labels were less enthused when those same interviews turned into diatribes against colleagues or industry practices. From a reporter's lens, this dynamic made Browne both compelling and tragic. A figure who could not betray his ideals but who often paid the price in loneliness and strained relationships. His outspokenness was both his badge of honor and his burden, and the very fire that made his art so powerful sometimes burned bridges around him faster than he could rebuild them. Looking back now as a reporter reflecting on decades of coverage, the story of Jackson Browne's feuds with his contemporaries forms a fascinating chapter in his larger legacy. That of a man who insisted on authenticity in a world increasingly dominated by commercialism. While many of the bands he criticized, Toto, REO Speedwagon, Air Supply, Asia, Chicago, and especially the Eagles, went on to massive sales, radio dominance, and enduring fan bases, Browne's catalog remains revered for different reasons. Songs like The Pretender, Running on Empty, and Dr. My Eyes endure not because they were engineered for mass appeal but because they spoke to real, lived experiences in language that felt unfiltered and true. In many ways, his critiques of his peers amplified the contrast between him and them. He is the torchbearer of songwriting as social and emotional responsibility, and they as emblems of an industry chasing broad popularity. From my vantage point, the tension itself has become part of history, shaping how we understand not just Browne but the entire Laurel Canyon era and its aftermath. His anger may have alienated him from some, but it also solidified his reputation as someone unwilling to play by the rules of commerce. For future generations, that defiance has become a central part of why his music still matters, serving as a reminder that art can still be about truth, even when surrounded by spectacle. As a journalist closing this long investigation into Jackson Browne's quiet but fierce battles, I cannot escape the conclusion that his story is both inspiring and sobering. Here was a man who rose from the bohemian enclaves of Laurel Canyon, wrote songs that defined an era and achieved global fame, yet still felt compelled to fight for the soul of music even as the tide turned against him. His feuds, whether with Toto's sterile perfectionism, REO's formulaic ballads, Air Supply's romantic illusions, Asia's corporate supergroup model, Chicago's pop pivot, or the Eagles' betrayal of community ideals, were never just about dislike. They were about Browne's larger vision of what music could and should be. For him, music was not neutral. It was a force for honesty, activism, and connection, and anyone who abandoned that mission was, in his eyes, failing their audience. That stance made him both a hero to some and a curmudgeon to others, a man revered for integrity but criticized for rigidity. Yet decades later, his songs continue to be sung, studied, and admired, while the debates he sparked about authenticity versus commercialism remain strikingly relevant. In the end, Jackson Browne's place in cultural memory is that of the conscience of a scene, the one who refused to let success blind him to responsibility, even if it meant standing alone. And perhaps that is the truest measure of an artist. Not how many records they sell, but how deeply they insist that art still matters, even when the world around them seems content with less.